Hello fellow World of Warcraft fans, welcome back to a new video on my channel. Today we're going to talk again about some comments from an interview from Ian Hezekiah Stars, which he recently gave to the magazine PC Games N. In it, he talked about Midnight, some things we already know, but also about the add-on purge back then. He explains that the players really thought they wanted to completely shut off add-ons, how the whole thing was received, what was learned from it, and so on and so forth, and why this step was necessary. We'll take a look at all of this in this video. Feel free to leave a like, subscribe if you want to see more, if you want to support me. And I'll be honest here, when I first read about the changes they had planned, I wasn't really happy. I'm still not completely happy about it. At least I do miss weak auras in some way. But it also partly has to do with the fact that I really hate setting up my add-ons and my UI setups with a passion. Now you could of course say, well, then just don't use any add-ons. That's where point number 2 comes in. I just find the standard Blizzard UI absolutely hideous. I don't even mean that in a bad way, but I just can't play with it. It looks like 2007 with a few fresh assets slapped on top. A lot of important information is missing. So I would still say, if you want to have a decent UI, you can't avoid putting something together yourself with add-ons. But, well, in the end it went better than I thought it would, so apologies to Blizzard for that. I also exaggerated the whole thing a bit. So, in the end, he's talking about the basic situation. Why were add-ons even nerfed in the first place? Let's put it that way. And it's about encounter design. He says again, add-ons were simply too strong, and they had to design new dungeons and raids around add-ons. And I can definitely agree with him on that. I've been raiding Mythic for the last 4 or 5 years, always getting cutting edge. And I don't know, something I always found really annoying was simply that you went into a new raid. For example, in the War Within or in Dragonflight, whatever. And on the first night with a new boss, I can remember very well, for example, where was that? Where was the boss? War Within, here Palace of the Nerubians, for example, Overnax. So we stood there for an evening, for an hour, and just kept adjusting like Vigawan. In the end, I would say the whole thing kind of escalated on its own. So Blizzard designed bosses that were difficult to solve without add-ons. As the best example, I can always mention from Dragonflight, Aberrus, Echo of Neltarion. You just got an ability there where you had to coordinate 5 players within a 30-meter area in 5 seconds. Everyone had to stand pixel perfect, at least on Mythic. Otherwise, the whole raid would die, and this ability came, I don't know, every 30 seconds or so, at least in the first phase. It wasn't humanly possible to coordinate that quickly. So, first you have to see who has the debuffs, and then you always have to send people to the right corners. You also can't just say, I don't know, if player A, if I have the debuff now, I always go to Skull or something, because of course it can also happen that suddenly all 5 people who were supposed to go to Skull get the debuff. So it wasn't mathematically possible, I would say. Now you could ask the question, was the boss so hard because the add-ons were too strong before? Or were the add-ons too strong because Blizzard made the bosses too hard? I think the truth is somewhere in between. But yeah, that was a case where you would never ever have beaten it on Mythic without add-ons. I'm not a Liquid player or anything like that. Maybe they would have managed it eventually. But apart from the top 2, top 3 guilds, I don't think anyone would have beaten that boss within 4 or 5 months without add-ons, and there are more examples of that, for Firak, whatever. It was simply necessary at times. So, he also said many mechanics in dungeons and bosses weren't even tried out because they knew, okay, these mechanics would be solved by add-ons. So in the future, we can definitely expect 1 or 2 new features. And in the end, he says that players looked for solutions in real time. So players were faced with challenges during boss fights, and the add-ons solve these challenges for the players in real time. And he says that this was something that didn't really lead game design or class design in a good direction. I definitely agree with him on that. That wasn't really fun at times. And like I said, I didn't enjoy standing at some bosses and setting up weak auras for an hour either. And anyone who says, well, just play without it, you noobs, has never played a mythic raid boss and has no idea. Sorry, I just have to say it like that. Anyone who posts an opinion like that in the comments just disqualifies themselves completely. Yeah, a first boss, I don't know, good players could probably beat that even with their eyes closed. But there have just been bosses in the past that you wouldn't have beaten without add-ons, or maybe only after 5 months or so, and then only because of a lucky attempt where everything just worked out. And that can't really be the point. It can't. And otherwise, he says here that in the end, the 12.1 update, so the patch, is supposed to be a small overhaul. Like how add-ons and the game communicate with each other. This is supposed to make everything easier to understand. And at the same time, yes, add-ons will be a bit more restricted because of this. Currently, there are still some small loopholes that add-ons can use to display more than what might be intended. That will no longer be possible with patch 12.1. And he says, all in all, that the team responsible for this internally is currently still learning a lot. You first have to adapt to these new circumstances. And there will simply be a few more difficulties here and there along the way. And also, in his opinion, even if he thinks it's a controversial statement, the new interface is a complete success. It's not finished, it's not perfect, they need more work. But in the end, the players are still doing the same content they did before. And at the same time, they need less help. And I actually have to agree with him on that. At least for myself, I've noticed that at some points, to be honest, I still miss a weak aura. Honestly, I've just gotten too used to it. For example, where I often fall flat is in the Windwalker Tower on the way to the third boss. Those dudes on their Windwalkers, Striders, Dragon Riders, you know, those creatures there with the long necks. When they start casting that spell where you get interrupted if you're casting, sometimes I don't notice it in the heat of the moment. In that case, a weak aura was really useful. But overall, I had a lot of fun at the start of the season and still do now, mostly playing without any aids. So that's why I think the whole thing is pretty good and so on. In the end, he says there are still a few exceptions where the community has figured out how to break things. And that's something, yeah, that they're still working on because they didn't want to break anything in the middle of the patch. So you can already expect that certain add-ons that might seem very, very strong right now will be further nerfed in the future. They just didn't want to do it in the middle of the patch where maybe people have already killed bosses with them or something like that. And he says in the end, all these changes were not, as many players have claimed, intended to kill add-ons. But they know that add-ons are part of WoW's DNA, and they want add-ons to continue being part of World of Warcraft. Just that they don't have as much of an impact on encounter design as they did in the past. And I have to say that's a reasonable statement from his side. I can definitely understand his points. So what do we take from that? In the end, it's been a big learning process for Blizzard, and it still is. And you can already expect that in the future, more add-ons or even more add-ons will be further restricted. Although I have to say here, personally, I don't use any where I would say it's giga strong, or where I know that it's supposed to be shut down. That's why I think this will impact very few players. Share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video, and take care.